When I was 5, my grandfather, Phil Erenberg I, passed away in his mid-80s. So to me, in my 5 years of life, he was always just grandpa. So he was, the guy who helped spoil me with, cool presents and gave me lots of dessert, and I got to sit in his big leather chair that was worn with lots of years of sitting. And to everybody else in the family, he was many different things. He was a doctor, he was a father, he was the patriarch of the family, he was a lot of great things. So as I grew up, lots of other stuff happened, more people died, whatever. And so I realized more about my grandfather as I grew up. And this story is basically about how I got to know him in his life the further we got away from his death. And it's interesting to realize how a person's legacy, what they leave behind after they die, is a way of keeping them alive. And what happens in the present and what you do with your life now really impacts everything that happens in the future. So basically, my grandfather was a lot more than just grandpa. He was an immigrant. He came to America from Russia when he was 2 years old on a boat, and his family settled in Chicago and then later moved to Los Angeles. And they escaped a lot of the growing tension and persecution in Europe that would eventually climax into World War II. So they were really lucky to leave. In addition to that, he eventually got into a car accident in his young adult years and ended up crushing his shoulder and is basically totally useless. And as part of his rehabilitation, he ended up going to the gym and doing shoulder exercises, and then ended up getting into swinging Indian clubs. And that led him to compete in several different competitions with those Indian clubs. And that's a sport that doesn't exist anymore now, but back in the 20s and 30s, it was like kind of a big deal. So kind of a big fan of that. It was a big deal then. And so eventually, when I remember when I was 3, I was looking at a frame on the wall full of medals. And I was like, cool, it's a picture of medals. But then as I got older, I realized, and we still have that frame of medals, that each one of those medals was a competition that he won from swinging Indian clubs. And there was one medal in the middle of that frame that was bigger than the rest. And, as a child, I was like, cool, that's a big, shiny medal, whatever. And then later I realized that was from the 1932 Olympics that took place in the Los Angeles Coliseum. And he was a silver medalist in that Olympic Games. And he was competing with a bunch of other people, and he came in second place by 2/100ths of a point. That was how much he lost the gold by. And he was Jewish, and the judges were German, and this was 1932, and no one is drawn the connection directly, but, he had, everyone always asked him about that circumstance, and all he ever had to say about it was, I showed up and I did the best I could, and that's all I could do. And so that kind of turned out to be like a little bit of a cool story about him. And then after the Olympics, he ended up going to medical school, and he became a doctor, and he worked his way through medical school by being a journalist by night and a student by day so that he could support his family, all now in Los Angeles. And he practiced medicine for 63 years, and most of his patients were sort of, the people who really needed medical care the most and who couldn't afford it. And he worked mostly for free for those people. And he did it often, took house calls at night and at odd hours, and just gave everything of himself, and always with extreme humility. So as I grew up, I got to know that man, and as I'm now an adult, I'm getting to know that man more because of how he overcame adversity by persevering through it and creating opportunities out of every challenge. And there were many other challenges he faced. He and his wife, who was my grandmother, had trouble conceiving a child, so they adopted. And eventually they did conceive a child who was my father. And that's the story of my grandfather. And that was Phil Erenberg I, and I am his biggest fan. Thank you.